Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that a lot of people in our audience don't know what affirmative action is. I think it's one of those buzzwords in politics that we assume people outside of our inner circle know, and probably most people are not aware of, or if they are aware of the practice, they don't know the word for it. So I actually want to roll, this is surprising to you, I know, I want to play this Tucker Carlson clip about it, and then I want your reaction to it. So let's roll this.
The promise of a meritocratic society is that the most capable people will rise to the positions of the greatest authority. In a meritocracy, for example, you would hire heart surgeons because they're good at heart surgery, not because of how they look or who their parents are. A meritocracy is the only fair way to run a society, and fairness matters to people, always, everywhere. Plus, it works well. Fewer people die on the operating table when you do it that way. For generations, this is how American society ran. If you were smart and you worked hard, you could compete on pretty much equal footing against anyone else in America. They tell you that was never true, but it was true. It was called the American Dream. People moved here from all over the world to partake in that system. But there was a political problem with it. If you've got a meritocratic society, it's pretty hard to play race politics because race plays no role in advancement. Individual initiative is what matters. Group interests are irrelevant in a meritocracy. Now, that may sound idyllic to you. It may sound like the kind of country you'd want to live in. But for the Democratic Party, it was a disaster. How do you get your voters to the polls if they're not racially aggrieved? It's hard. So at the tail end of the civil rights movement, after all the legislation guaranteeing equality under the law had already been passed, Democrats introduced a new concept. They called it affirmative action. The idea was to punish or reward Americans based on the color of their skin. Ironically, this was precisely the evil practice that the civil rights movement was designed to abolish. Racial discrimination was unequivocally wrong. That was the whole point of the skirmish on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the March on Washington. Oh, but no, said Democrats, slyly repainting the slogans on the barn. Actually, racial discrimination can be good. It all depends on who's being discriminated against. That was their argument. That is still their argument more than 50 years later. But even now, after all of this time, most people, if you explain it clearly, don't really buy it. Wait, I can't have a job or get into college or get a federal contract because I was born with the wrong skin color? That sounds wrong.
So Brad, I very strongly agree with Tucker on a few things. First and foremost is that Americans want to live in a meritocracy, me included, right? Like I was told that growing up, that in America, you work really hard, you have opportunity to get ahead, and if you are smart and you do the right things, then you can, have anything you want in the world. And that is what I want in life, right? I don't want to be handed anything. I don't need a participation trophy. I just want the right to succeed on my own merits. And I think that I would say that's where most other Americans are. What do you think?
I agree completely in terms of that being the aspiration and the goal and the American values that have strived for. I think Tucker, the part of this I don't fully agree with is when he says that's what we used to have. I'm not sure that is what we used to have. There were barriers for lots of people. I agree that maybe we all agreed on that as a goal more in the past, but I'm not sure we ever lived in a perfect meritocracy like he says. But I do think that's the goal, and it should be the goal, and is for most Americans, because affirmative action is really unpopular in the polls, even among Democrats and even among racial minorities. And that's because Americans are meritocratic. But I was poking around a little bit on this, and Harvard is at the core of one of the cases that's going before the Supreme Court. Because even though they're a private college, they take tons of federal subsidies, which means they're basically legally required to have an equal protection and non-discrimination like a public school would. Let me read you this, Hannah. This is something I discovered from Kenny Zhu in City Journal, which he is a Asian American conservative writer. He's a really prominent activist against affirmative action, and he's compiled lots of good data on this. Here's what he writes. Duke University economist Peter Asuriacano estimates that an Asian American with a 25% chance of admission to Harvard would have a 33% chance if he or she were white, a 75% chance if Hispanic, and a 95% chance if black. So you go from 25% chance of admission to Harvard if you're Asian to 95% if you're black with all the same scores and everything else. That is not meritocracy. That is some perverse system where we're uplifting some people and downlifting others on the basis of immutable characteristics. And so if that gets a big blow struck against it by the Supreme Court, which I think it most likely will, I'll be celebrating that decision because I think there's value in diversity, but I don't think forced diversity at the cost of discrimination is something we should pursue.
So I agree with you, and I want to go back and give a little bit of like just historical settings. But after the Civil War, we passed the 14th Amendment, and this basically says that all Americans should be treated equally under the law, right? It's a great law, it's a great premise, and I 100% back it. And then what happened is you had a lot of people not obey that and have Jim Crow, for decades and decades. And ultimately you get to the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, and that accumulates in the Civil Rights Act. And then affirmative action comes through an executive order passed by LBJ, right? And the whole idea was initially that if you were getting federal funds as a business, you couldn't have these intelligence tests basically that they were trying to use to block black people, right? They would do these kinds of things where they're like, we're not treating you differently under the law. You just don't score as well on these tests. You're just not as smart as other people. And it led to a lot of really racist beliefs. The premise of affirmative action was not, and I agree with this, that black people are not less intelligent. They've had less access to education. When they have been given an education, they've had worse schools. There's been many policies that have been put in place to hold them back in these kinds of academic achievements. And so using those kinds of tests should not be valid to block them from employment, should not be this loophole to get you out of equal application of the law. And this is, again, talking about businesses that have federal funds, right? As this goes on and progresses, it starts going through the courts. It eventually gets extended to where it applies to many people of color. It starts to apply to women as well. And then it really starts to extend into higher education, which is mostly where we see this battle being fought today. And that is because, one, a vast majority of colleges and universities are public. And even those that are private, like you mentioned, like Harvard, often get vast sums of money, taxpayer dollars behind the scenes for a multitude of reasons. And so as a whole, we now have a system of higher education in this country where white people and Asian people are basically discriminated against under affirmative action, because they say, because there are so many more white people and Asian Americans are scoring highly, and because we want to have a more diverse pool of people coming into our colleges, we're going to basically downrank you because of your skin and uprank these other people who aren't scoring as well because of their skin. And so obviously this leads to what I would say is a continuation of racial division in this country, right? Because you are continuing to treat people differently on the basis of their skin color. You're also saying to people that there's reason to have animosity between the races, right? Because now you're competing on these grounds. And so I think, and I say this as a woman too, we see women graduating college at higher rates than men, and I think that's fantastic these days. But the number one thing I hear from men is like, well, you got affirmative action then. And it's like, well, I mean, it's hard to combat that, right? And so I think it actually can hold you back as a woman trying to, progress in society, as a person of color trying to progress in society, when people see your achievements as something you just got because you got this special handout, special favor. So as a whole, I think affirmative action is very racist. It's very unfair. It's very unconstitutional. But where I will push back on Tucker, and I think this is what you said, is that we never had a straight meritocracy. We always had in this country serious things on the books that held some people back, that prioritized some people over others. And there is still real underlying systemic racism that has to be grappled with. And I think I want to go back to that in a little bit. But as you said too, when we're talking about diversity, I think diversity is a wonderful thing, right? When you don't have a group of diverse people in a room, you miss things. You don't see perspectives. You aren't aware of everything that you're talking about. Having diversity always leads to more information, more wisdom. It's a desirable thing to have. But notably under affirmative action, they actually aren't even prioritizing true diversity. And this came up during oral arguments where they were questioning Harvard's attorney who's having to defend this law, and he basically said two things. I want to roll this clip. He said, one, that they rely on self-reporting to even determine who falls into the racial categories they're prioritizing. And then secondarily, he admitted that they don't prioritize diversity in things like ideology, religion, nationality, socioeconomic status. Let's roll this clip really briefly.
How are applicants from Middle Eastern countries classified, from Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, and the like?
My understanding is that just like other situations where they might not fit within the particular boxes on the common application, that we rely on self-reporting, and we would ask, they can volunteer their particular country of origin.
But if they honestly check one of the boxes, which one are they supposed to check?
I do not know the answer to that question.
So, Brad, when I heard that, the first thing I thought of was Elizabeth Warren, who famously, as a white woman, said she was Native American to get into school and then use that to teach at school and has used that to propel her career all the way up to the Senate when she finally got called on it, and turns out she's less than 1% Native American. How common do you think that is?
Yeah, well, that's the problem is self-identification, and also the way they treat these racial groups as monolithic. Has never made any sense. A good example is absolutely was there past horrible discrimination against African Americans and descendants of slaves? Yes, but the affirmative action system treats somebody who is an immigrant from Nigeria, from one of the elite rich, top 0.001%, who's been privileged like a prince their whole life and comes to the States for college. They have not faced racial discrimination, but they get affirmative action the same as an African American who's a descendant of slavery, whose family faced systemic racism, who there's been a wealth gap. Like, it has never made sense because it treats people as if they've had a uniform experience because they share an identity box on the census, but that's simply not how reality works. And then, like you said, colleges don't care about diversity in any real sense. This came out during the oral arguments about this affirmative action case. They care about visual diversity. They care about the kind of diversity that shows up on your brochure. So you can have one of every person of every color, and you can check all your boxes and say, look how diverse we are. They don't care about diversity of religion. They don't care about diversity of ideology and political views. They don't even really care about diversity of experiences or diversity of personalities or just plain old meritocracy like the rest of us care about. They increasingly just care about the identity politics, visual diversity, and they're reverse engineering their systems to get that at the expense of real, true, meaningful diversity and meritocracy. And I think everyone loses from that. Not just the people who are discriminated against, but also the people who are uplifted to positions where maybe they shouldn't be based on the merits, or they should be, but now people are going to cast an eye at them and view them as an affirmative action pick when actually they really do deserve to be there, all because of this broken system that values the wrong things.
Well, I love that you brought that up because that very issue actually came up with one of the justices on the Supreme Court. Justice Sotomayor actually admitted during oral arguments that she was an affirmative action graduate, that she would not have gotten into her Ivy League college had it not been for affirmative action, that she didn't have the scores, she couldn't have been able to compete. And I thought that was really interesting on a couple of premises. So one, I would think that if that were the case, she should recuse herself. Like, that seems like a very glaring conflict of interest to me. I'm not sure if that struck you that way.
I don't agree, only because the standard for recusing yourself from a case for Supreme Court judges is very, very high. Like, this came up when people wanted Justice Thomas to recuse himself from January 6th case because his wife was texting or involved somehow, I don't know. And he didn't. And I remember listening to some lawyers at the time saying that, like, the bar for recusal is really high. In fact, like, a bunch of these justices went to Harvard, right, who is a party in this. Like, if you were to start recusing people with any connection to cases, you would run out of judges pretty quickly. I think, because you could also say that someone like Brett Kavanaugh, as a white man, was a victim of affirmative action, potentially. Like, as much as Sonia Sotomayor may have been a beneficiary, according to herself. So I'm fine with her not recusing herself. But I thought that was a glaring thing to just say, yeah, I benefited. Clearly this is good. Well, because she's also, like, the least, just to be honest with you, the least impressive of the liberal justices. Like, Elena Kagan eats her lunch and is much more respected than Sonia Sotomayor. So it doesn't super help her case.
Well, and that brings me to my next clip I want to roll. Tucker Carlson actually went after her pretty hard for not really deserving her seat on the bench. So let's roll this clip.
Affirmative action is not only the very definition of racism, it's also highly embarrassing in its particulars. The closer you get to it, the more embarrassing it is. When you elevate people on the basis of their appearance, you tend not to get very impressive people. Why would you? Unless you're buying sunscreen, skin tone is a totally irrelevant criterion. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor unwittingly made that point today. Sotomayor openly concedes that she got her job because of affirmative action. She was completely and demonstrably unqualified for the position.
So I think what you said earlier is absolutely correct. This leads to people saying, you don't really deserve this. You don't deserve to be here. You didn't earn this. You're just getting this handout. And I think that that's, to me, that's not how I as a woman would ever want to succeed, right? Like, I don't want the first female president to be there just because she's a woman. Like, I remember so many people saying they were so sad when Hillary Clinton didn't become president. I was like, I'm not. I want the first female president to be somebody who's earned it, who's achieved it on their own, who's like actually a person of merit and character, and I want to be proud of the first.
You're telling
female.
me Hillary Clinton isn't a person of merit and character?
Not really. But okay, so I want to move on from this though, because Justice Sotomayor also made another, that I thought, bombshell comment during oral arguments, where she basically said the quiet part out loud in arguing for the continued need to have affirmative action. So she said, if you're Black, you're more likely to be in an under-resourced school. You are more likely to be taught by teachers who are not as qualified as others. You're more likely to be viewed as having less academic potential. I thought this was significant because I 100% agree with her. And I've been making this argument for at least 2-3 years now that government public schools are one of the most systemically racist institutions in this country. And we know that. We know that kids who are Black are trapped into failing school districts. They are there largely due to old practices like redlining that made sure Black people could only live in certain parts of the city. We then dictate where kids go to school based off of their zip codes. And we then fund public schools largely based off of property taxes. And so if you live in a poor area that collects less in property taxes, that school has less funding. You're also more likely to be in a high crime area. You attract less qualified teachers to go to these schools. And of course, you have worse and worse academic results coming out. To me, that is one of the strongest arguments, and always has been, for school choice. Right? It doesn't matter how much money you throw at this program at these problems. We've seen that we're spending on average $15,000 per year per kid in public schools. It's not working to fix this disproportionality that we continue to see because it is systemic. And the only way to fix that is to break the system and let kids escape these failing schools through school choice. So I thought she actually made an excellent argument, not for affirmative action, which is treating a symptom of the larger problem, but for actually restructuring public schools.
Yeah. Sonia Sotomayor, the least likely school choice advocate of all time, coming out of the woodwork here. But I found that interesting too, because I don't necessarily disagree with her either, but you can't back end try to fix it. Like, after they're all educated through their K through 12, say, well, we need to correct here at the end and send more African Americans to college because they didn't have opportunities early on. That's actually setting them up to fail in college by putting them in places where they couldn't get on their grades and SAT scores, which predict their academic ability to keep up in college. That's part of why we have a big gap in college academic outcomes between African Americans and white Americans at the college level. And so you have to go back to the source and fix the source, not try to just jerry-rig a more equal outcome at the end. It's kind of like when they do this with, we're going to mandate that 1 in 5 women, 1 in 5 board members of a company has to be a woman. Well, it's like, you're not really fixing the problem, which is that there are so few women in the C-suite to begin with to pick from at the highest levels of business. Like, how do we fix that? You can't just jerry-rig a better outcome at the end. That's not going to work. And I think that's essentially what affirmative action tries to do.
Yeah, and as a result, it does end up being very racist. I want to roll this last clip by Tucker.
So just to remind you, something you already know but probably never think about, the U.S. government collects data on people's races. Now, in a society where we're all equal as citizens under the law, why would they do that? That's what the Nazis did. So we're against keeping track of people on the basis of race, aren't we? And with so much at stake, how do we determine someone's race? How long before we're taking blood tests or measuring the shape of people's heads? It's been done before. It happens in other countries to this day. It's really dark and disgusting. So the question in that exchange was, what box do the Middle Easterners check? Oh, no idea. But of course, everyone knows the answer. If you want to get into a competitive school, the best bet for those Middle Easterners would be to identify as Black. And studies prove it.
So I agree with Tucker here. I think it is a racist system on its face. I think it's wrong. What does irk me, as somebody who's spent a lot of time working on criminal justice reform and other areas where there is overt systemic racism, is that people like Tucker and conservatives will shout you down and say, how dare you suggest government's racist? How dare you say this? And then turn around and admit that it's systemically racist when it's a policy they don't like, right? And it's like, if you can admit it in these areas, why can you not see it across the board? And I just think this is why tribalism makes you stupid and blind and unable to ever like actually really come together against the larger issues we face, which are things like systemic racism, which is corruption and injustice that government has codified into place. So I just wish he could be a little bit more self-aware around that.